So, hello everyone. Thanks for coming to the session. I think all our panellists are in the room. I know Doug is here, Holly's here, Aisling I think is here. Where are you? Let's see. I hope she's here. Oh, no, that's... Anyway, she'll be here somewhere, I imagine. That's someone else, that's Hazel. We're looking forward to the session. I'm going to hand over to Theofanis Exadaktylos, who's going to kick us off for this session. We're going to be talking about the role of trust in public policy implementation and design, and we're going to talk about what the role of public engagement might be in building that trust, what forms of public engagement that might take. We're going to start off with us giving you some provocations, some material to get you thinking, right? So this is not a fully worked research presentation, but we just want to kind of present some themes, some concepts, a little bit of data to get the conversation going. And then we're really happy to have our panellists here to give the perspective from public organisations, both at national and central government level, including contributions from Wales and Scotland, which is fantastic. So that's the idea. We do have a couple of interactive activities for you. So there's going to be a scrumbler, there's going to be a Mentimeter. So we're trying all the apps today across Access. So please do feed through your ideas later on in the session as we go. Okay, I'll hand over to Theofanis.
Thanks, Alice. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. And as Alice said, this is not intended to be a research presentation, but exactly some ideas and food for thought for our discussions and our connection between those who do research and those who are practicing research or applying research in their work. So I would like to start off by saying why we need to talk about trust. And as we all know, and for the last few years, representative democracy is in flux. So we have seen a continuous decline in the levels of trust in formal political institutions, the government, the parliament, even the courts. We have seen a decline in trust in economic practices, so the banking system, the financial institutions, but also we have seen a reduced ability of us as humans being able to affect our environment in a kind of a positive way. Trust is important because it's central to governance, and here it is something that we talk about, governance, and the way that the processes of decision making may actually work to advance some of the issues around environmental policy and climate change policy. Trust is the key element that will facilitate coordination between those who are working on particular policies and those who are targeted by specific policies. It reduces transactional costs. That means that we do things a little bit more efficiently. We trust each other, right? We don't have to get to know each other from scratch. And of course, it creates a very important element called social capital, which is seen as the cohesive force within society. Right? It connects the citizens, it connects political actors, it connects civil society, but also epistemic communities, and that's very important. And it connects the business sector, I would say. Yeah. So when we have high levels of trust leading to a high social capital, then we are able to implement policies in a more successful way, and most importantly, achieve the policy objectives that we have. Meaning we spend within the resources that we allocate and within the time that we allocate to a particular policy itself. It's okay, just need to slide. Right. So we have a few challenges for trust that we are experiencing in the past few years, and partly the answer to all these things has been, okay, let's use digital tools, let's use e-democracy, let's use e-consultation, let's put an E in front of everything that we do in governance practice. So that's pretty good because we are really opening up processes. But we are opening up ourselves to different problems, especially around the rise of populism, fake news, misinformation that comes through artificial intelligence tools as well. Those of us teaching are experiencing that in our own students, which is not very exciting. But we have also seen new inequalities being created within a digital society. So if we think about these kinds of challenges, there will be implication about our ability to create sustainable cities and communities and economies, and this is quite important because, again, we have been through a multiple set of crises in the past few years, and we are bound to see a few more in the near future. So we need to somehow future-proof the sustainability of our communities, of our cities, and the economies, and of course connect society in different ways. But the way to do this is actually by trying to bring the citizen into the mix. And I think that part of the impact side that we are trying to create through this project has to bring in the citizen at the heart of it all. Because the citizen is at the heart of our democratic processes. And what we know is that our voices as citizens, and if we kind of like take our hats off for a moment and think of ourselves as ordinary citizens here, we know that our voice is incorporated in the formal side of things. Yeah, in a few weeks' time, we will all go and cast our ballot. Great, and we can go online and view a consultation process by the government and so on and so forth. But not every citizen is connected to those processes. Not every citizen knows how to access those processes, and not every citizen will actually engage with those processes. So that immediately brings up challenges of polarization because people are not well informed about things, don't actually understand how their voice is making an actual contribution to the state of things, and of course, it creates new systemic challenges in terms of marginalizing specific communities, leaving other groups of society out of the mix, and of course, it gives the ability of dominant groups within the political system to have a bigger weight and a bigger say in how things are run. So, what we know, and this is part of what Alice will talk about in a moment, is that citizens express a dissatisfaction with the formal side of politics when it comes to especially environmental stuff and climate change. And that leads to an overall creation of distrust around the political system and what its abilities are to make things change or go forward. Right? So effectively our democratic processes are becoming less functional, and the outputs of those processes are being constantly challenged. As a result, any policy output that we have out there has a harder time being implemented, and of course, the representative nature of that policy output is questioned. Right? So how much does this policy output represent us as citizens, or takes into consideration the voice of the citizen? Now, for some of you this may be familiar, so I will briefly mention this. This is more like an intersectional lens of every individual, as a citizen. So there are those key demographic characteristics that we all know about, but at the same time, we also have policy characteristics as citizens, right? In terms of preferences about things that are informing our decision-making processes as citizens. And every single one of us has or subscribes to multiple identities, And at every point in time, with every issue that we are facing, we are also prioritizing one identity over another. So I won't go into the demographic ones, but let's say, let's get some social ones, right? I'm a driver, I am a cyclist, and I am a pedestrian all at the same time, But every policy that I come across in terms of traffic management or pollution or healthy lifestyle and so on, really bumps onto different aspects of my identity, my triple identity there. So when I'm driving, I'm cursing at cyclists cutting me off. When I'm a pedestrian, I'm cursing at cars, walking through a pedestrian crossing, etc., etc. So what we need to see is a more holistic view of who we are as citizens and try to understand that intersection of multiple identities, the kind of preferences that it creates. To that effect, what we actually need is to try and engage with the citizen in terms of increasing their civic competence, how they can do things in civic life. But in order to be able to do that, we need to actually bring in their cognitive competence and their perceptual competence. When we're talking about cognitive competence, we want to increase their political knowledge, we want to educate them about the issues of the day, we want to give them a multiple set of pieces of information there, and we need to mobilize their brain to start thinking about things that they could consider as not relevant to them. And on the perceptual side of things, we need to be able to increase the understanding that citizens have of the policy-making process and how they are making a difference there, how their participation is meaningful, and to try to take them out of a label that they may think of themselves as not really being able to comment on things or not being able to understand things. Yeah. So effectively, what we are interested in giving citizens is a sense of agency and a sense of ownership, because that is actually the part that allows citizens to think that they are contributing actively to the creation of policy. So I will finish with this one and hand over to Alice. I mean, we are talking about, interdisciplinarity on the one hand, we're talking about knowledge exchange, transfer, and so on, and networks, yeah? So if we bring the citizen to the center of this mix, we can see how the citizen, or we can try to see how the citizen can connect to local government, can connect to transnational partnerships as well, advocacy groups, the central government itself, but also us as an epistemic community, right? Academic and non-academic elements, and to the private side. Now, in terms of democratic engagement, the four key elements have to do with co-designing and co-creating the process on the one hand, but we need to close that loop with the citizen, and that means allowing them to co-assess and co-monitor the policy output. And that's quite important, because at the moment, we are doing a lot of deliberative stuff that allow the citizens to design and create things with the policymakers and with us as a research community, but we don't close that loop. We don't allow them to really assess the output. We don't really allow them to scrutinize. And how do we do that? We can increase participation. Yeah, we need to look at the next generation of citizens. We shouldn't be ignoring that, right? So we need to reach out to schools. We need to engage the next set of leaders in the field, and we can do that with mini publics and different citizens' assemblies. We had one yesterday at Surrey, which was really, really nice in terms of engaging, the general public and getting them to think around the planetary boundaries and the different social desires and needs that we have. And of course, trust building. And the key mechanisms to trust building have to do with transparency. The more transparent the processes are, the easier it is for the citizen to see what is happening out there. Ethics, right? So trying to avoid, the non-ethical side of policy making in terms of the actual output. And of course, offer greater clarity and more channels of communication. That actually is important because it avoids citizens looking for information in places where they're likely to be faced with fake information, with deliberate agendas, and so on and so on. So, I will stop here and hand over to Alice for some more exciting data and pictures.
Okay, so thanks, Fanis. So yes, you can see here on this slide, there's plenty of agency going on here. There's plenty of demonstrating. So this form of public engagement is born out of opposition to particular policies. Okay, so that's fine and that's important. That's vital. That's kind of the lifeblood of democracy. So we've got plenty of of action from vocal groups, sometimes from vocal minorities. And then equally we have we have here some people kind of opposing particular policies which might be deemed kind of pro-environmental. On the other hand, we have groups who are coming together to push for more radical policy and to oppose other types of public policies. Okay, so what we have is plenty of democratic engagement on climate and on the environment in the UK. We've got these strong views. But here we go. And in we have this context of high media salience. So we've got a lot of political interest. We have political parties politicising environmental issues. That's both mainstream and smaller parties. And even if we have, if environmental policy is not the top priority for parties, they have a position one way or the other. So political scientists talk about policy inaction as being just as important as policy action. So the environmental policy agenda is there. It's very prominent. The public are interested. And what we also have is, in general, public support for action on climate. We know polls repeatedly tell us that citizens are concerned about the environment and that they support the net zero agenda broadly. Now, you can see from this slide there are some political differences, but even amongst, there's kind of broad support generally in terms of action for net zero. Okay, so now this is just one graph, but we see this kind of pattern replicated in different surveys. Now, and here we have also a kind of slide which shows that people recognise the importance of the renewable energy sector and clean tech in terms of its contribution to the economy. So there's a recognition that this is perceived as being the leading kind of area of growth alongside AI, which was spoken about a minute ago. Even for kind of contested issues like low traffic neighbourhoods, we see more support than opposition for these sorts of issues. And so this is a graph from the Climate Barometer recently. And they are suggesting that if we look at the data on this graph, we can see growing support across the political spectrum over the last year. And what we see is that what they argue is that this is perhaps a window of opportunity to build trust in this type of policy, which are contested. But what we have is an environment, I think, which is quite difficult for that trust to be built. And so the next slide shows what people think about institutions and their ability to do what is right on climate. So we've got, you can see on this graph, thankfully for us as universities, we appear to be quite trusted in comparison to everyone else. So maybe we have to use that platform to think about how we influence the public, or use our platform to kind of make change and make convincing arguments and ensure that we remain to be seen as credible and trusted. But you can see the graph there, the media being the least trusted, followed by government. Now, of course, this might be a wider reflection of trust in the government of the day. We see, NGOs being more trusted in business. We see the EU being more trusted in the government, which is interesting in the UK. So we can see this overall decline, and if you look at all those negatives, you can see that mistrust is growing, and these are all statistically significant changes. So I think it's important that we recognise this in context, that we're trying to get people trusting of policy and involved in developing policy and having their say. Interestingly also, when you look at people's trust in different groups of people to tell the truth on climate change, scientists and climate experts come up high, but really interestingly, people like you, ordinary people, that's where people draw their influence from their own friends and family. So when we're thinking about how to effect change and how to influence or communicate, we need to think about how do we cultivate conversations amongst the general public so that people, going back to Fanis's point about being informed, but also knowing that they can make a difference and that their views are going to be listened to. So how do we cultivate that and think about influence through those channels? So moving on to what is it where does public engagement come into all this? So currently, there's lots of activity in this field. There's lots of citizens' assemblies and other types of mini-public going on at national government level. Here you've got the Scottish, the Irish assemblies. You've also got place-based activity. So the climate commissions in Surrey, for example, and other places, trying to catalyse place-based public engagement and provide opportunities for different stakeholders and organisations to work together in a kind of organised, facilitated way. You've got bodies like ADEPT and UK 100, which are getting leaders from public agencies, local government from different parts of the country, talking to each other to try and share best practice and kind of move things forward. And then you have NGOs and coalitions of NGOs themselves, like the People's Assembly for Nature, coming together to try to get members of the public engaged in conversations that can help inform their own work. So there's lots of activity. We have public bodies creating their own public engagement strategies. We've got work by Natural England, by the Scottish Government, a recent report by the Local Government Information Unit, which Patrick kindly supplied to me yesterday, so hot off the press. So yeah, there's a lot of activity going on in terms of public agencies wanting to engage the public and trying out new methods and mechanisms for doing this. At the same time, we have a hugely growing body of evidence from social sciences about how we can best facilitate public engagement, and what does that mean? So the public engagement takes many different shapes and sizes. And it's not possible to kind of summarise all the work here, but it's important to recognise that social scientists are making contributions to this area, and I think there's a lot of partnership working now going on between academics and bodies like Natural England or others through programmes like Access, Renew and many others to try to work together to, try out some of these different participatory approaches to see what they can each contribute and what the limitations might be. So just some key insights from the research literature about, engaging the public. There's a recognition that ad hoc consultations have their limitations, but, they do have strengths. They can allow us to kind of really, explore issues which are challenging, where we need answers, and we want to start to look at what solutions there might be. But the biggest challenge, I think, is integrating the more routine, consistent participation across the piece. And the challenge, one of the main challenges here is, the costs, the resources required to do this. In a context of austerity, it's very challenging for local authorities to have the money, the resources to do this on a kind of ongoing basis. So that's still a puzzle which needs to be kind of recognised, and there's lots of debates in the deliberative democracy literature looking at some of these issues and how do you routinise and institutionalise democratic participation. But yeah, there's an emphasis on ensuring that the processes seem to be legitimate, so procedurally legitimate, that people can trust the process, that they can see that they know how the outcomes of their participation will be used. That's vital. There's issues around involving people at different stages of the policy process, which Fan has mentioned, right from the beginning, from designing policies to kind of looking at how we monitor them and evaluate them. Inclusivity and diversity is essential, so that we're having, that everyone has a chance to have a say, and that it's not simply the usual suspects that are participating. So that often means, kind of going to where people are in their own communities, working with community groups to try to engage everyone in their own context and context they feel comfortable and are willing to, tell researchers, tell policymakers and practitioners what their issues are. So we need to kind of think more about how we do this. And so, those are just a few insights from the academic literature. Crucially, reaching consensus isn't always possible, and having those spaces where people can simply disagree with one another in a safe environment and have their voices heard. And what we see from studies of deliberation is that people are very capable of updating their own views in light of what they hear from others, if the deliberative conditions are right. Often it's just about finding out what the areas of disagreement might be, but also what are the main trade-offs that people are willing to accept in terms of policies. And many publics, for example, can play a really important role in that type of process and can help public authorities know how to go forward. Policy that suits everyone is not possible, but I think there are ways in which we can understand better how to make policy that will at least take account of people's preferences, their own needs and their own interests. And I think place-based approaches finally can help address some of those trust issues we have with public institutions, because they allow people to kind of deliberate and engage on issues that matter to them in their own communities. But then you have to have the accompanied devolution of power, of course, in order for those place-based approaches to be able to deliver solutions for people. Okay, so that's all I have to say. But we just wanted to give you those provocations, some insights from the literature to start a conversation. So I'm going to invite our panellists to come up and have a seat. I saw Clive at the back there. Hi, Clive Mitchell. Sorry, I forgot to mention you earlier. Apologies for that. Hi. So yeah, if you'd like to come to the front. We're delighted to have all of our speakers here. And we're going to be very relaxed about this.
Yeah.
We're not going to chair this session. We're kind of going to let you guys have a self-regulating, free-flowing discussion on the basis of what you've heard. Just thinking about your own experiences working in the Marine Management Organisation, NatureScot, Devon County Council, and
Natural Resources Wales.
Thank you. And we'll hand over to you, but while we do that, there is a QR code there. If you'd like to take a picture, go to the link, what you can do is, as the audience, just write down the 3 most critical factors for you for building trust and support for policies like low traffic neighbourhoods, which has been a very controversial issue here in Exeter. So this is something which might come up with possibly. But yeah, so we're not just thinking of this policy, but other types of controversial policies. So we'd like to go on that. Can I open the floor for any reactions? Doug, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Head of Environment at Devon County Council, really pleased to be here. The main thing for me that came out of your presentation just now was the note around understanding that the people behind the organisation developing the policy can be people like yourselves. So we find we have most success, I feel, when we are engaging people face to face, which we haven't been able to do during COVID. So for the climate change project that's been running in Devon, which got up to speed during COVID, a lot of the engagement was online. It wasn't possible, but since then we've been going to the county show, we've been going to community events, we've done a few here at the university meeting your students. And if somebody walks up to you at the county show, with a dog, with a child, with a shopping bag full of interesting things, you can have a conversation with them on that level, realise that they're just like you, or that you are just like them, and then you can start talking about climate and the policies that are being developed. And I find you can have quite a transparent and open conversation that way, a more nuanced conversation. You can really understand what it is about the policies that are being developed that they're actually upset about, rather than perhaps the headline issue.
I think that's a really good point. I was thinking about the question you've got there on the critical factors for building trust, and I think one of the massive ones, which you did mention, is transparency and just being honest. I think especially in the backdrop of all the fake news and the amount of information that there is, I think that honesty is really important. I do think it's also a massive challenge because it's much easier to communicate if you have a really clear, clean message. And actually, with a lot of the climate and nature issues, it's not a clear message. It might be that something works in one place but doesn't in another, or it might be that a particular action is great for the net zero agenda, but it's actually not good for nature. I don't really have an answer for that, but I think it's something to acknowledge, because it's not always easy to have that really simple, oh, here's the solution, that's what we're trying to say. And those face-to-face conversations are great for trying to pull that out. But if you're doing it on a mass scale, and you're just putting something out to the whole public, I think that's really difficult.
To go my voice here again a bit. Gosh, there's an awful lot in that, isn't there? So I think some of the issues that have been raised across the 2 days, really, to do with time to build trust, I think are really important. And that's really difficult, where trust works at multiple levels between individuals, I guess primarily, but depending on how those individuals behave over time, you can build a trust, institutional trust as well. But that's quite difficult when there's a lot of churn, and that churn is at different rates in different spaces. So politically, obviously, it's quite rapid, perhaps a bit less so at the sort of official civil servant level, even slower in some organisations and arm's length bodies like NRW and so on. But then for communities, citizens, obviously in it for life, as it were, And so they see all these changes and changes in individuals and what organisations are saying and so on, as we all do from the personal capacity, obviously. So it's quite difficult to kind of reconcile all of those different levels over time. I think it's really important that, you know, where we do try and shortcut that process, it usually ends badly in terms of breaking down trust. And particularly if you're dealing with wanting to implement policy and practice in remote spaces, like most of Scotland and I guess most of the marine realm as well, you've really got to have trust and a willingness to implement policy and practice as desired, because policing is expensive, if not really nearly impossible. So unless you have those kind of co-produced, co-designed solutions that take time, actually, even if you do it quickly, it's not going to work because it won't be implemented in the sea or on the ground or wherever the case may be. And I guess just finally, in terms of the co-production question, I think some of the issues that Jai was raising earlier, there's a tendency, I think, to be quite tokenistic in the way that we engage people, ticking boxes for youth and ethnicity, etc., rather than, and I think social sciences could play a much more important role here in identifying the interests and the viewpoints that are at play around particular issues and who holds them and why they might hold them and what they stand to gain by that and so on. Be much more transparent about things like the distribution of costs and benefits, who's involved in the decision-making process, and what the consequences are of leaving some people, some interests outside the boundary that we're considering.
Cool. Thank you, that's really helpful. So, one of the things that strikes me that I think is worth saying, because I work in an organisation that is a policy implementer, when it comes to designing or developing the policy, I have as much ability to be in that as everybody else in this room. And quite often, being the person that implements the policy actually comes with its own challenges and difficulties. So in terms of trust, I just wanted to point out that as an institution, a government institution, we have challenges around people trusting us. We also have challenges around trusting ourselves and having trust in ourselves and trusting those people on whose behalf that we are working with. And so trust as a study or a research topic is really incredibly interesting for a whole range of reasons. And I think that almost to give a case example, so it wouldn't be saying anything unusual to point out that that as a marine manager, the people that we manage don't trust us very much. They really don't, and in fact it's almost fabled how much there is aggravation between us, and really I think that is because of the crisis, because of the shortage of resources, because everybody is stretched. We're stretched as a government organisation, and there are stretches because of there aren't enough fish in the sea. So there's something there around understanding that actually if you break down a lot of the superficial aspects of it, we're all in a similar boat when you're at sea, and there is something that collectively we need to do together in a very trusting manner to get ourselves to a better situation with the environment, with climate, and with our society and our own well-being. So there's something in that about knowledge and understanding and values of all of us. It's not an us and them. And that's a really big part of thinking about trust, I think. And particularly because we are a decision maker, understanding what decision can people actually make. So if you're inviting people to participate or to be deliberative or to co-design, in the very end of that, who still makes the decision? And that's a really big problem we have. So, so I work in the science team in the MMO. we think and talk about trust and co-management all the time, about the process, the practice, and we try and push it and help our colleagues to enact it. But in the end, they always say to us, but I have to make the decision. It's not the people in that room that make the decision, it's me. And there's something about finding our way to a trustful decision being made in the end. And that's all about the things that are really hard. Distribution of power, transparency, fairness, and space, the space to contribute. Because our one of the main groups of people that we regulate don't have the space, actually. They are tide bound, they are weather bound, they are family bound, they are economically bound and socially bound to the context in which they're working. And to expect them to take a lot of time out of their earning day to come and hang out with us while we talk about who trusts who or not is actually quite a big imposition. And it's very important for us to find a different way to do it. That's what's challenging and interesting in my job and for my team. And I find, in terms of trust, I come back to trying to understand myself and all the people that I know. I find that really helpful, and to learn from the people around me all of the time, because that helps me analyse and think about and enable trust in a much better way. And I think that everything that we've been talking about over the last couple of days has made me think about how much intuition we don't bother listening to, or how much of being human we don't bother listening to, and how if we listened to ourselves and were ourselves more as humans rather than policymakers or policy implementators or academics, that maybe actually we could come together in a more trustful way. And just to finish off, sorry for talking so long, but I keep thinking about the spaces I sometimes find myself in where I'm able to talk level to level, usually in a pub with, say, a fisherman, and I can just listen and hear. And we don't talk about climate change. We talk about hot fish. I caught a bass yesterday, and God, it didn't feel the right temperature when I took it in my hands to put it in the box. And what's going on there? And what do we do about that, you and I? And that's where the really good conversation, that face-to-face conversation happens. And I didn't know that bass are hotter than they used to be. That's fascinating as a fisheries scientist, but also it's a big problem, because a hot bass is going to go off much faster before you get it to shore, before you get it to market. There's a whole bunch of intersecting systems that we have to talk about when you have that, and you just have this random comment at the end of a bar. And so the thing that I come to at the end in trust is, who's responsible for the system? Who's responsible for caretaking the trust in the system, for the processes and the principles, and is that us or them or all of us together?
Fantastic. Yeah, these are all amazing comments and really thoughtful points. And I think one of the things that you all come together is this. You go back to that slide with all the different groups. It does break us down in a very crude way into different types of people or different roles. And actually, just having time to be together. Trust is about understanding one another's worlds, about listening, about having a chance to develop trust through repeated interactions, whether it's at the Devon County show or in a pub with a fisherman, or in some other means to talk to farmers or whoever you're engaging with, your stakeholders. Those issues of power, I think, are so important to think about, and what are we inviting people to engage on? It should be on their terms. It shouldn't be about, okay, we think that climate change is the biggest threat we all face. What do you think about this? No, it's about what's your understanding, what's your experience, and I think the kind of lay knowledge that you have from whether it's fisher people or farmers or members of the public or whoever it is, who have their own experiences, so it's seeing things from their perspective rather than ours as academics or as policy people, or is vital. So it's how do we I'm left with the challenge, how do we make that more widely available, those opportunities to have that more informal interaction, because it's all about processes and mechanisms and less about day-to-day engagement. So to me, that's still a huge challenge.
Yeah, no, absolutely. sometimes it's not about greater interaction, it's about the right type of interaction, because greater interaction also increases mistrust, right? We create the opposite effect there. Also in terms of clarity of the message, that is very, very important. Although the wrong kind of communication can lead to adverse effects, so we need to be very mindful of how we communicate certain ideas and certain messages out there. And what we have missed out on this is job descriptions. So clear job descriptions, I think, so that people know exactly what their role in a particular process is, and this is more likely to be impactful for the policy-making side rather than the ordinary citizen side. But when every actor involved in the process knows exactly what they are supposed to do and how they are supposed to contribute to the process, that increases that clarity and that increases the effectiveness of that interaction, right? So we don't step on each other's toes. And there was an important point here about the concept of horizontal trust. That's trust among each other. If we look back about 4 years ago, this is what saved the day during COVID. Not trust in government, because I was pretty low at about 32% at the time. But there was high trust in each other, so that we kind of felt that our neighbors would also do the right thing, that kind of element. And we also had trust in experts. So at that point in time, the NHS and the nursing staff. So, like increasing the trust in the expertise side so that people feel that they are getting the right type of information, or they're getting a reassurance that people who are experts in this know what they're talking about, and that they trust their neighbors to also do the same thing. So the fisherman that was talking to you, should also talk to their colleague who may be overfishing or using illegal practices, right? So we need to understand that kind of thing. I guess, yeah.
So we have 1 minute. I can see 3 hands. Okay, we're going to start with Simone and Sarah and then you, and then if we have time, Gary. We finish at quarter past.
Yes.
The next session starts at 5:30.
Okay.
We have a bit of a buffer.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's perfect. So
Thank
we can
you.
actually
Perfect.
listen to the comments
Thank you.
and
We'll
get the
your question
questions
as well,
all
Gary.
together.
Okay, Simone.
Yeah, I'm quite struck by the tension at the heart of your project between the model of citizenship that you've chosen and the outcomes that you're expecting to achieve. It seems to me that you've sort of latched onto quite an individualistic approach to citizenship, and you could choose a much more relational understanding, because that model of citizenship assumes that there's a kind of direct relationship between citizen and state, and there's plenty of literature about the fact that that may not be actually how we relate, and the fact that if you prioritise that model, it immediately underemphasises the more social relationships between people and the context in which they experience citizenship as part of other social organised groups, other institutions, for example, that are often in tension, so between being a citizen and being a member of a family, for example. And I don't see that as different identities, but different institutional relationships and different kind of networks and ways of performing one's role as a human being in particular contexts. And I think that's also reflected in the idea of a public. I mean, I don't really think that there's such a thing as a public. A public is something that is a result of a conceptual relationship. So you only, you talk about the general public, but there is no, I'm not the general public. Who's a member of the general public? We are, you're creating different kinds of publics when you're defining the idea of the citizen and designing the idea of the policy. And then, that comes back to haunt you when you complain about the usual suspects always being involved in policy processes. But we've heard already from several people that it's a lot of time and work to get involved in the policy process. So it is a self-selecting activity. Whether that's joining a citizens' assembly, responding to a planning application, it takes a lot of education and commitment to be that kind of active citizen. So I think if you're aiming to create trust, then you have to break down those notions of citizen and public in order to see why trust is a you know itself is very differentiated and very complex.
Yeah.
And I'm also struck by an absence in your description of all of these processes where there's no role at all for the elected representative. Mm-hmm. So all of this time we're trying to reinvent local democracy, and we already have local democracy. And I think what we learned from many years of planning theory is that if you ignore the role of the local representative, you undermine democracy and you leave them without a legitimate role. So for me, one of the clear, really important tensions is in direct democratic process and in participatory policy making, is that how do you do that without undermining the structures and institutions of government that we already have? And that, to me, is really important if we're talking about trust. And I think it worth maybe spending a bit more time focusing on that problem, because otherwise it will end up like basically pulling down some of the things that you want to achieve on the other side.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I mean, this is a provocation. So yeah, I mean, elected representatives, play a critical role. They're the guys, people that mediate between citizens, people. I wouldn't say the public, and the political system where decisions are taken. I think some of these mechanisms are trying to respond to the fact that people don't seem to be engaging that much with the formal political system, with voting levels have gone down. People don't necessarily take the time to go and see their elected representative, or if they do, it's kind of, there's not really a conversation going on. It's nowadays it's all on social media. It's just about giving opinions. So I guess some of these mechanisms, I think, can help in starting to have better conversations and dialogue. I think that's where they come in, but they're not seen as a replacement for representative democracy.
Yeah. Yesterday we had
After you, Doug's go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Yesterday in one of our mini publics, I was approached afterwards by a lady who lived in Surrey, in my home county, and she started talking to me about the problem of flooding. And then as the conversation went on, she started saying, oh yeah, but flooding is related to water, and water is affected by what they are spraying on us. And I'm sat there with a very serious face trying to, not to kind of react to this kind of conspiratorial element. And she was saying about how the government should be managing, the after effect of what they're spraying on us, because then we're all doomed. And she said, oh, I'm chairing a committee that deals with these issues. Okay? And she asked me for advice on how to collect the lines and how to make her point known across the government. All I'm trying to do with this example is that, we are all coming from different points of views, and some of them are more extreme or misinformed or bound to be, let's say, dragged by conspiracy theories or what have you. And a lot of the things that we are talking about are actually questioned by the public in a non-legitimate way, but they are questioned. So I think, we're not discarding the role of the elected representative, but there are elected representatives out there who are actually supporting these kinds of views. So we need to also marry those two sides, where our own elected representatives are well informed about certain issues. And the second bit is that we need to address the issue of voter turnout, because the formal political process and the decline of participation in formal political process by the citizens may lead them to seek information elsewhere by non-elected elements. So local governments are notoriously known for low turnout rates. I think that at Surrey, for instance, we only had like a 25-30% turnout for our latest sort of council elections in Guildford. So, quite a well-off area of the country with, minimal issues to face in terms of the bigger questions out there. So, it's about trying to find ways of connecting those who are in the leadership of decision-making. Those are the executives, and they may be elected representatives as well. And the people who may not feel connected to those processes. So one of the things that I mentioned had to do with civic competence. governance, right? And that is the part where we are taking the person out of their individualistic side and we're trying to provide them with tools that they can use in order to see the collective understanding of things and try to see how the individualism, the increasing individualism of society has changed the way we do things. But anyway, that's my view.
Doug, did you want to be?
Yeah, I'll be really quick. The climate assembly that was run in Devon, that was used as a tool by our elected members from a range of local authorities in Devon, there's still 2-tier authorities in Devon, to enhance the democratic process, to give them information about what a non-self-selecting sample, or as small as possible, they all pay £400 to attend. And the main outcome we got from that, in terms of a change of local political opinion, is that until that assembly happened, we had pretty much zero support for onshore wind in Devon. About 89%, pretty sure it was 89% of the assembly wanted to see more onshore wind in Devon, and we now have a carbon plan with actions to lobby government for changes to the National Planning Policy Framework around the essential ban on onshore wind, signed up to by a number of Conservative authorities in Devon. So that was a real switch, simply by giving the elected officials the information about the true opinion of a sample of the people of Devon.
Yeah. So yeah, the links between the like representative and the more participatory community-based consultations are really important, and I think Devon have been used to lobby central government for resources to implement sustainable solutions. I'm right. Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, that's
ask a
great.
question?
I'm interested in the relationship between trust and legitimacy. And sometimes trust is that end of pipe focus, or draws attention to the end of the process where policymakers want to get trust from citizens. So the focus is on how you get that trust from citizens. But if you shift the focus to legitimacy, policy legitimacy, then the focus is on how policymakers can make more legitimate policy. So the image you had just now, which was public opposition to traffic systems in local areas. The reason they're opposing it, right, is because they see the policy as illegitimate. They're not listened to, but that's secondary, right? So I think sometimes the focus on legitimacy, it could be procedural legitimacy, which is what we're talking about here, I think, in terms of deliberative democracy. But I think the responsibility shifts when you move from trust to legitimacy, away from the public having to trust, citizens having to trust, to policymakers having to create legitimacy.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah. Yes, I think 5 minutes. Thanks. Yeah. I'll take more questions and then maybe we can come back to that point.
No, I just wanted to very much support the last two speakers, Simone and I'm sorry, I can't remember your name. I wanted to kind of reframe it because we're talking about elected representatives, people who are there to represent us. And that means that, that they may or may not be doing a good job. So that I support also your point about legitimacy, that they need to be seen to be doing their job in a legitimate and effective way. And that may well involve consultation with the public, whatever that might be. But it doesn't mean the same as trying to invoke everybody to make decisions. We elect people to make decisions on our behalf and assume that they, or hope that they are going to do so, that make the right decisions. And that then means that the discussion about trust, I think, is, you started off by saying that trust has been declining. Another way of thinking about that is that actually that in the past we were more accepting of having effective elected representatives, but as a result, for example, of the effect of social media, that we found ourselves more involved and therefore apparently less trusting. So that the trust is not is a kind of secondary effect, not a primary thing to worry about in itself. It's an effect, not a cause, if you like. And what we ought to be doing, therefore, in my view, is making sure that our elected representatives are effective, are good representatives, that they are legitimate, that they do things the right way, that they find out about all the issues that are required and make the right decisions, rather than try and make everybody involved, because we've all got other things to do.
I mean, it's interesting that when elected politicians hear the results of things like mini publics and they sit in and listen to them, they tend to be very receptive to what they hear, because they hear stuff that they wouldn't normally hear in their surgeries or, you know, through the mailbox. So I think I hear what you say. I think there's strengthening the political system itself is important. But I think there are ways you can do that by pulling in voices in a different way, perhaps, in a more democratic way.
Yeah, it's about recasting the purpose of those. I'm not saying we shouldn't have those kinds of things, but they should be recast as a way of informing our elected representatives, not as a way of having kind of a general unelected democracy.
Yeah, they're rarely seen as decision-making bodies, I think, but you're quite right, yeah.
Yes, comment there.
Okay, so just picking up on some of that, I think there's a really important points have been made. And again, just picking up on, you know, what do elected representatives represent? Is it individual votes that we all cast, or is it the lobbying from corporations and other organisations that inform the decision-making process? And obviously, I kind of meshes that together. But I think it's really important to recognise the power dynamics between individuals and what can be read from a whole range of individual views, and what is often taken from more powerful institutional lobbying for policy and particular interests and so on. And I think that also points a bit towards the kind of legitimacy to act and where that comes from, governments. There's been quite a lot of discussion in that in Scotland recently, particularly as, you know, with some of the significant changes at UK government level in relation to net zero. You know, the Scottish government acted as it was wanting to do in relation to its 2030 targets. It might have created a backlash from Scottish people in saying it's not fair. People about England don't have to do this stuff, but we have to do it in Scotland. So all those kind of questions of legitimacy for politicians to act in relation to big issues like climate and nature are really important. And a lot of that is also adapted to individual, institutional dynamics.
Shall we take the final comments as
please.
a comment?
No, we have
Before
to
we...
stop. I have to stop, sorry.
Okay, that's
Sorry, Gary. We'll carry on afterwards. Thank you. There's some stuff on there. Thank you for your comments. We will look at this. I'll study it in detail afterwards.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.